What's up?
Oh,
We did. I'm
we
gonna
made
try
it.
to plug this in. Let's see. There we go.
Is your
No,
phone dying?
but
Oh, I was saying mine's hanging
but
in there.
th this tends to drain the battery a little bit. So there we go. Sweet. Cool. How are you?
Good.
Doing
How
pretty
about
good. It's
you?
been a busy day as usual.
I hear you. I know I'm one call to the next today,
Yeah,
but
I'm supposed to
all
get
good.
this done, then go get a haircut. All this gray that my clients are giving me.
Oh, I became a blonde last week, so our last live I
Oh,
was had darker hair. So
yeah.
in case anyone didn't
I did
recognize
notice
me,
that your hair is lighter.
yeah, I went. I had like a whole like thing
Oh
of
yeah,
foil in my head last
the whole
week,
thing.
and yeah,
One
the whole
nice thing
ordeal.
about being a guy is gray is like cool. Like it's okay. You can
It's
right,
distinguished. Yeah. Well, luckily I'm
right.
not gray. Like I'm not there yet. Like I did have like one hair that I was like had my husband look at, so I was like, is this gray or blonde?
Yeah,
And had to
that's
confirm, but
funny.
not there yet.
Cool. So we'll dive right into it because I know our time's a little more limited today.
Yeah.
But um, for those of you jumping on, Sarah and I wanted to talk about a pretty cool topic, I think. It's talking about feeding up. So, meaning, you know, reversing people, our hormone dysfunction cases, our gut cases, like all of these cases that generally come in and are have a few major underlying issues that kind of are, present case to case. That is under eating, and that is usually, over exercising, over doing too much activity, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that at least I see issues with this feeding up process and in the thought process of like just feed someone up as much as you possibly can and get these calories as high as you possibly can because that's going to help fix the underlying issue, which is sort of true, right? But it's also there's some situations where you definitely need to be careful feeding people up.
Right. There's definitely nuance as there is with every topic. And I think reverse dieting was like super hot for a couple years in our space of like you said, just like, oh, feed people up, increase your calories, and that like fixes everything. And I think we're kind of seeing more now, like, no, not necessarily, or there is more nuance to it, or like you said, like we're seeing a lot more GI, kind of cases, and you can't just keep feeding those people.
Yeah.
So yeah, not sure
Well,
where you
so
wanted to start it,
I
but
think first off, we can talk about some of the issues that you may run into with these long-term feeding periods, because inevitably, we're getting people that have been under eating for not months, but years or decades in some cases. So the process needs to be pretty long in the sense that we can't just feed. We know if we just get someone's calories up in 2 months and we throw them right back into a deficit, that we're probably not going to get the result that we want, right? They're probably just going to resist again. So um, talk about cases that you may want to be careful feeding up and how we might go about kind of navigating that. And I'd say the first and most obvious one is GI cases, right? So like
right.
why would we potentially have an issue in those cases?
Yeah. So if you've been under eating for a while, it's almost like you have to retrain your digestive system in a way you can think about it. So like chronic under eating, it leads to issues like low stomach acid, slower motility, and that's, multifaceted, right? Like if you've been under eating for a while, thyroid is going to be downregulated, and thyroid hormone is super important for the digestive process too, and then digestion is important for thyroid, so it all goes together. But working on kind of slowly and incrementally making these food increases so your body can tolerate it, and you can actually digest and absorb these nutrients. And we're also like kind of working on your gut health while we kind of make these gradual increases. Because if you just keep feeding somebody and then they end up constipated, or they run into issues because maybe they have some like leaky gut going on because they're stressed out from these years of dieting, that can lead to just more inflammation and not the results that you're looking for.
Right.
Long
So,
term.
you mentioned a few things: low stomach acid, maybe low pancreatic enzymes to be able to digest food, slow motility because of those reasons, but also because of their hormones, right? And because they're stressed. So those people oftentimes do have hormone issues, right? So it in our minds, we want to be like, well, this person needs food from a hormonal and metabolic standpoint, which is true. But like you said, they can't assimilate the food and digest the food. They don't have much hunger a lot of the time, or if they do have hunger, it's like cravings and weird, cravings because their gut microbiome's off. So it's not like they're having consistent hunger cues. So there's some things that we can do and consider with these people. And I think the first one is, for me, is kind of boiling down to like, how quickly would we maybe want to feed those people up, or how would we go about assessing that? Food selection, and then maybe even meal frequency, right? Could be important.
Yeah. So I think for me, it depends on the person. Like, I don't think doing like super small meals like very frequently is necessarily a great idea, but I think like working on just evenly spacing throughout the day is going to be big. So like that could mean like every maybe like 3 to 4 hours having a meal, just kind of working on giving your body kind of some time to have things go process through, working on that motility, really working on like kind of the stress aspect of it. So things we talked about in our previous live about like making sure you're not stressed out when you're eating, just doing all the things so that your body is in a better spot to digest this food. That's going to be big, like working on like what types of food we're choosing. So that might mean not letting fiber get, too crazy high. A lot of times these cases, it's usually people that were dieting for a long time. So they're usually like veg heads, like eating like higher volume. So it's going to be like having those conversations of like, hey, I see that you're doing a big salad, for your second meal. Can we maybe make that like a rice-based meal with some cooked veggies?
Right.
For
example.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of bad habits there, like calorie hoarding, so you can like eat a bunch of calories at certain times of the day. Like a lot of people like to calorie hoard for that last meal of the day, perhaps. We've all done that. Everyone's done that.
And then people think they're not hungry during the day, but it's like, no, you've trained yourself. You've trained hunger signals to be hungry at night, right? Or you're so full first thing in the morning because you still have food in your stomach.
So the goal with food selection and distribution would be to, in most cases, distribute things relatively evenly, so like we're not having any huge, spikes or dips in blood glucose and insulin, which is also going to be no big spikes and dips in ghrelin and leptin hormones. Like everything's pretty smooth. Hunger is circadian based, right? So it's like, for example, like if you normally eat a meal at 10 a.m. and then one day you skip a meal at 10 a.m., you're going to be hungry at 10 a.m., right? Especially if your body is trained to eat on a clock. So getting those circadian patterns down, spreading food out evenly, and utilizing foods that are going to support motility, enough fiber, right? Enough fiber. For some people that may be 20, 25 grams, something like that, especially people that have come in eating, I've seen 50, 60 grams of fiber, like they're getting all of their carbohydrates from vegetables, So spreading that, utilizing those food selections that are going to move things through easier. That might even be like lowering protein in some cases, bringing protein down, using carbohydrates that digest quickly and easily, and getting those hunger cues in. So not fasting, like using fasting might not be something that you want to do. It's a tool that's popular and it has its uses, but not having periods where you're not eating until, they're like, well, I'm busy in the morning, so I don't eat till noon. Like, yeah, it's convenient, and it can be okay in some cases, but when we're trying to retrain hunger, we're trying to retrain the circadian pattern, we don't really want, 14-hour gap between feedings.
Yeah. With those people, I'll usually start with like pushing it 2 hours like forward. Like, so if they are having their first meal at noon, I'll be like, okay, let's say 10 o'clock. Like, let's start there. And like eventually like eating within like an hour and a half, like 2 hours of waking, I think, is a good goal. And then like fasting overnight, like 10,
yeah, and I think that's good for most people. And the reality is a lot of those people, as we're moving food up, food's not so high that like you said, you don't need a super high meal frequency. I mean, 4 meals is probably sufficient for the majority of these people to be able to spread things out without the meal being too big or too small, right? What people kind of tend to forget is with meals, digestion takes a while. So like if you're eating a very high meal frequency, you're overlapping in digestion throughout the day. Like even if the meal is small, by meal 3, 4, 5, 6, like you're still having some of that food undigested and carrying over from meal to meal. So
yeah, at least 2 hours for that migrating motor
right,
complex.
and that's depending on and that really depends on too, like food selection. If we're doing a lot of like animal-based proteins and things like that are gonna, or animal-based fats, those things are gonna take a while to digest and get all the way through the digestive tract. So so that selection is important. So we're actually feeding people up in terms of looking at calorically, how would we maybe go about feeding people. I think for me personally, there's like an initial assessment period where I can kind of make that initial adjustment and then see what kind of response I'm getting. And I think that for a lot of people, I can get food up to what I would consider more of a maintenance level. And before I can go beyond that, I have to let them kind of sit there sometimes for a little bit while their gut starts to heal and adapt and their hunger patterns come back. So for example, if they come in and they're eating 1,100 calories, maybe I can successfully get them to 1,500 or 1,600 calories, which doesn't seem like a lot, right, for healing, but maybe that's all the better that we can do for a short period of time until they acclimate to that, and then we can start making those increases again.
Yeah, and that might take me like, 4 to 8 weeks, depending on, kind of the person. Like I try to like make an initial increase of like maybe like 150 calories, like 200 calories off the bat, again, depending on the person, just to kind of like kickstart them. But, I think, like you said, I think like giving your body time to like get used to that. So like, let's say like we bump it up to like 15, 16. And then from there, once your body, every like biofeedback is good, like digestion is good, energy levels are good, like then we kind of make that,
and
next increase.
There's one other huge component to this is expenditure, right? So calorie balance is activity plus food, right? It's intake plus output. So when we are looking at calorie balance, sometimes for people, especially ones that have this really high sympathetic drive where they're really stressed out, activity can play a huge role here. Like maybe we don't have to increase food very much initially, and maybe just bringing down systemically stressful activity is the move for those folks. Like maybe getting them up to that 1,500 calories, but lowering expenditure drastically is really all that we have to do initially. So when we're doing that feeding up process, we have to consider activity. So for me, I'm generally looking at a couple things. One, I don't worry as much about low systemically stressful activity at first, unless someone's doing like 30,000 steps a day or something ridiculous. Like walking is not stressful until you're neurotically walking, 25K steps a day. Like that's a problem generally.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're past like 12, 13K, I'm like, what is your job? Like, what do you like? Are you forcing these steps to happen? Like once it gets past like, that like kind of 13-ish K
Yeah.
mark?
So for those people, bringing down expenditure is going to be a huge consideration at first, and then training is a piece of that. So I'm going to assess how much training volume are we doing? Okay. Do we need this training? Do we need this much training volume? Because generally with these cases, when we're healing, like muscle maintenance is kind of the goal, right? We're probably not building any muscle. So we don't need an exorbitant amount of training stimulus to maintain the muscle tissue and maintain the physique. So a lot of the cases, like we can bring down, I mean, you could probably bring down training volume by half in a lot of these people, and that's going to be a huge expenditure drop.
And that might even help like with like appetite too, because I know sometimes like for a lot of people, like, training can, kill your appetite. Like a lot of people say like, oh, I'm hungrier on rest days. So kind of just bringing down that stress might make it easier to, kind of get this food in, like you're saying, just kind of lowering that sympathetic drive. And then, if we lower like that nervous system activity, your metabolism might upregulate by doing that, right? Because if we consider that exercise, while a good stress, at times can be, a added stress on the body. And when our stressors overflow, that's again, like kind of when the body gets the signal to downregulate, metabolism, thyroid hormone. So if we can, kind of send it signals that, hey, you're not always running from the proverbial tiger. You don't need to be conserving energy. You can, kind of continue to feed somebody up, which is so counterintuitive, right? Like, it's like,
because we're kind of we see a lot of these things like high energy flux and doing these things which can work for someone that's not stressed out. Right?
Right. Yeah. Like if someone, like if I have like Gen Pop, like, or we haven't had this extensive dieting history, like, yeah, I like to keep steps high and in the reverse and all that.
Sure.
But,
so it again, to summarize that, expenditure plus intake is kind of the equation to that. So once we start getting that motility moving, and they'll notice hunger cues. Generally people are like, hey, I'm getting more hungry, or I'm hungry for my next meal, right? Now I can start testing the waters again. I can start adding some food in, but I'm still going to probably go slow with these people. So this isn't reverse dieting that looking for, like, if we look at kind of the schools of thought on reverse dieting, like post contest, for example, we see that probably the quicker you get someone up to maintenance and surplus, the quicker you recover them. But that is not the context here, right? These are people that can't digest food. So this is where those 50, 100 calorie increases can become a viable option, right? So if they can eat, great. Like if they can eat, I might do more. If they're like, hey, I'm getting hungry, I might do more. But I would much rather increase them in small increments every week than be like, here's 400 calories, good luck.
Right. Yeah. So this is like, these are your people where we're going to give you 10 grams of carbs and, 2 fats or something. Like you were saying, like I generally leave protein constant, if not even bringing it down, like initially, depending on where they're at. Just again, like kind of considering like, the satiety, factor. And then a lot of people like that I find, in these cases are really high protein for their body weight.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or for, current needs. Like you're not going to go catabolic if you are 150 pounds and go down to, 100 grams of
I've actually experimented with that a lot in recent years and have kind of, I'm not saying I'm like seeing how low I can take people's protein, but I've definitely taken protein down substantially on some people. And, people also forget that protein as lean body mass base too. You know, if you're a 150-pound female and you're of average body composition or 160 pounds, like realistically, you probably have 110 pounds or 100 pounds of lean body mass if we stripped everything off, right?
That that's a good point because in these feeding up cases, I think people don't realize that if you don't have a lot of muscle mass, like we may not be somebody that's maintaining on 1900 calories. Like that might not be, you know what I mean? I think there's like this kind of camp of like, oh, every female should be eating 2200 calories no matter what. And it's like, well, no, like that's not necessarily true, or at
Right.
least not at this phase, right? So it's not just feeding somebody until they get to
Right.
some
Because
arbitrary number.
because especially with some of these Gen Pop people or people that are retired from competing, like maybe they're not as muscular anymore or whatever it may be, and we brought expenditure down, maybe they have a desk job, you know what I mean? Like their caloric needs really aren't as high as people, you know, think that they may be. So these numbers are kind of arbitrary. It's not it would be great if we could get every female to 2,500 calories and they maintain, but most of them just don't have the muscle or the expenditure to need it, you know? So, you know, I think that's important to keep in mind. So on the flip side of that, if we do have a client if we have a rare client that doesn't have a GI issue, but does need to, you know, feed up, we can move that process quicker, right? So something that I like to do with those people is maybe I'll make that initial increase a little bit larger, and then kind of let them settle, and then make small increases from there. Once I'm like, okay, we're probably at maintenance, let's bump up slowly from this point, because maintenance is of course a window for people, you know. And people are like dropping inflammation at the same time while you're correcting their issues. So of course, it's not uncommon for someone to maintain a body weight or within 3 to 5 pounds up or down and get them up 500 calories. Like that's pretty common thing. So for those people, you can absolutely feed them up quicker. There's no issue with that.
Yeah. So I think, this is where like, I feel like I don't even really use the term reverse dieting like all that much anymore, because it is kind of case by case, like how fast. And I feel like the reverse dieting has like a certain connotation of like what that looks like. And it does look different, kind of depending on your history and digestion and all those things. And blood sugar, like you could be somebody that's insulin resistant and needing to be fed up. So like for those people, like it might be, more of like a cycling, like a carb cycle, or, having like higher fats and, different kind of considerations there.
And look, so stress profile is important in macro distribution throughout the day, and also like layout, I guess, in the sense that if you are someone that has adrenal dysfunction, you're either, really high cortisol, or you're kind of all over the place, or you even maybe have low cortisol. That's where, again, like I am more inclined to spread people pretty evenly throughout the day, so we're not having too many big spikes, too many big dips. Those people I might not do any real crazy nutrient timing with, you know what I mean? Like I might not load up, 75% of their calories or 50% of their calories around training. It might just be a matter of keeping them even, because something that happens with people when we don't eat, or when we have really small feedings and we don't have sufficient food to maintain blood sugar, is our body's going to give us glucose somehow, right? So like when it does that, it's releasing cortisol and adrenaline, and that's liberating free fatty acids, that's liberating glucose to keep us stable. So again, that's where like fasting and hoarding calories and things like that. A great example is I was talking to someone about, they get really anxious, like if they don't distribute their calories more evenly throughout the day, they get anxious and feel kind of stimulated almost. Well, that's right.
That's what I was just gonna bring
Right. Well,
up.
what that
Yeah.
is that's that it's the body like, hey, we don't have enough energy substrate here. So it's like, give us some cortisol and adrenaline and trying to keep that blood sugar maintained. So that's not what we want if we're trying to balance out stress and balance out hunger patterns. So again, like we want feedings to be consistent and spread.
Yeah. And someone asked me this on my Q&A, but they're like, "Oh, like, is it bad to have like simple carbs like away from your training session?" And I feel like, people like you got to look at like a balanced meal. So it's like eating, regularly. Like, no, like in these cases, like you might like jasmine rice, white jasmine rice might be a great option, for dinner. It's just about like pairing it with fat and fiber. But like in cases like this where, we are trying to kind of increase your food, like the jasmine rice versus like the brown rice is probably going to be a much better option. So when we say like balancing your blood sugar, that doesn't mean like you
Right.
only eat carbs with
Because
fiber in it.
if we look at, so we had talked about motility. If we look at an example would be like a flush. Like what do you eat? A flush protocol is fruit juices and lower protein, and it's literally speeding up motility, and detox is part of the goal of that flush. What happens? Well, you're able to digest more food, you're able to eat more food, you generally are getting hungrier. And why does that happen? It's because things are moving through you.
Right. Yeah. And those, like, you can't forget about like the fats, right? And like the oils and stuff like that. Just, yeah, to kind of stay stable. It's not like a vegan or, what are those like crazy diets where it's like the banana
Yeah.
diet? Have you seen that? It's like people only like, you know what I mean? Like fruit, like a
Is that
fruitarian
a
or
thing?
something.
There might be,
I
but
don't know what to call it.
it's
I
probably a thing. I saw I
There's a thing for
saw a
everything.
reel
Yeah.
I saw a reel the other day. It was like trying to eat in 2023. It like popped up. It said you should not eat meat, and the other one popped up. It said you should only eat meat, and the other one like popped up. It said you should not eat veggies, and the other one popped up. You should only eat veggies, and the guy like throws all his food away.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he's like,
Exactly. Yeah.
well, what do I do now, right? So
Just forget it.
so
Yeah.
another kind of so like maybe a smaller point but important point is if we do have GI issues or food intolerances or the person's been under eating for a long time, I think a good policy at least early is to maintain consistent food selection during the early phases of this. So like I'm a big fan of food diversity because it helps with micronutrients, it helps with like gut microbiome diversity. You're feeding different bacteria. So I'm not someone that's like eat these four foods all the time forever. But but with some of these people, if I'm building a nutrition plan or they're a macro client, I am encouraging consistency early on in the process to make sure that we can actually like assess what we're seeing, because otherwise we're going to have inflammation response, the weight's going to be all over the place, and it's going to be kind of a mess.
Yeah, and you can have variety within a day too. Like if you're making yourself a meal plan, you don't have to eat blueberries for all, 4 meals, right? Like you can have some variety during the day within kind of those foods that you've been having, which is
Right.
hopefully more than 4 foods, but for not everyone,
So
for
I
some people
generally
it's not,
will
right?
do the way I'll kind of build it out would be, a meal would have a couple protein options. If there's a starchy carb in the meal, maybe a couple options there. Starchy carbs aren't the most micronutrient dense things anyhow, so it's probably not as important. But maybe a couple veggie options, a couple fruit options. But we're still rotating within a somewhat of a list. You know what I mean? Because sometimes with people that
Yeah.
are avid macro trackers, they play this game of like how much different stuff and how much, stuff can I change and fit in, and they love this variety. And that can even take a step further if they're like making concoctions and doing all this stuff, right? Like we know the people that are putting like guar gum and xanthan gum to the gills in these foods and making all kinds of stuff. Like that's not going to cut it.
Well, and that goes back to like the volume eating and like a lot of these people being afraid to be hungry. like they're afraid, like what, because it's such a foreign feeling. So what happens when I am hungry? It's like, well, great, like then we're gonna eat, and I think like yes, there's some guidelines as far as like foods that are more satiating, but I think you'd be surprised if you just ate enough during the day. And back to like keeping the meals simple, like if you're having like 5 grams of this, 3 grams of that, like and like having like all these different ingredients, like it just creates more food focus, which can make the hunger more of like a mental thing than an
There's
actual physical thing.
some really good points there. So one, being afraid to be hungry is a very real thing. Also, also that the food focus in the sense that like seeing how much volume we can fit in meals and seeing how we can, manipulate these meals and get fancy with it. And they the hunger patterns are dictated on timing, like I said, but they're also dictated on when you're eating, when you're eating larger into smaller boluses of food. So for example, like I eat most of my calories at night because I'm hungry at night. Well, I'm like, well, you're hungry at night because you don't eat your calories during the day, right? You're right. So like, yes,
Well, it is dumb,
right.
but like when you're so in it,
Yeah.
like you don't like you're
I
like,
mean, I'm like,
what?
you're eating
Like, yeah.
1,600 calories and 800 of them are in your last meal, and you're distributing 800 calories throughout the other 12 hours of the day. I'm like, and most of your activity is literally during the time where you're chronically under consuming calories, right? So of course you're
Yeah.
hungry by the time you go to bed, and of course you're going to want to hoard food there. So how about if we try evening that out and distributing, during that time? They're like, well, I don't eat breakfast because I'm not hungry. I'm like, that's because you don't eat breakfast, you know?
Right. So we have to train you. Yeah, I get that a lot from people that like train fasted. So like that's where like things like yeah, like having like, a banana. Like it's not like, we're asking you to eat like a huge ass meal necessarily in the beginning. It's just like keeping it, just some easy to digest foods and kind of retraining those
Yeah,
hunger
absolutely.
signals. And yeah, and stop wearing it as like a badge of honor of like, oh, but I run on coffee until 1 o'clock. Like, I've been there. Like, and I was very hangry and like a spaz because I was running on coffee
Yeah.
until 2 o'clock,
Yeah, it's an easy thing to do when you're busy, and mornings you want to be productive in that early part of the day. So it really just has to be a habitual thing. And the food doesn't have to be complicated. Like maybe if we are adding in calories, maybe some kind of liquid meal or powder meal is our first option in the morning, right? It's quick, it's easy. They can throw it in a little baggie or a shaker cup the night before. They can get up, they can have it. It's like that's a great way to start retraining that pattern. You don't have to get up and it's like, I don't have time to cook eggs and an omelet in the morning. I'm like, okay, cool. Well, we don't have to do that in the morning. Like we can, there's other options.
right. Yeah. Yeah. Blender, like smoothies, like purees, like anything like that. It's going to be definitely your friend. But I think just like really understanding like, hey, like to upregulate your metabolism, like we gotta like give your body this fuel. And the sooner in the day, I think, the better, and you'll see that, but you have to do it to try. So I just tell people like, hey, just give me a day, just give me a day. Like, let's just try, for one day and do a little experiment. And I think that's kind of a helpful reframe of like, okay, like I don't have to do this tomorrow if it doesn't go well, but it's like, you might like those fears about like hunger or whatever, like you might find that they're not true, right? It's like a story you made up in your head that you're going to be hungry or this or that. And, you kind of have to
Yeah,
prove to
it
yourself.
doesn't take long to retrain patterns. I mean, if you're someone that's updating your coach once a week, for example, I would say and venture to say in most cases you will notice at least some noticeable difference in a week's time. If you started.
For sure. I mean, think about traveling time zones. Like it doesn't take you a full week to get adjusted
Right.
to a new time
It's yeah. So if you stick to that meal frequency and spread and distribution of macros and food selection, and you do it for a week, by that sixth day, that seventh day, you're like, oh wow, I'm ready for meal one. I'm ready to go for meal one. Okay, I'm not as hungry for meal four or five now, right? So
zone. Yeah.
things are leveling out. It doesn't take long for that to happen.
And you know, I think back to what we were saying in the beginning about you haven't been eating enough for so long. Like, we're retraining your body. So, you know, thinking about like training in the gym, it's like repetition. It's like reps on reps.
Yeah,
you know, here
absolutely.
too.
Well, cool. I got to dip out and go get my hair
Yeah.
cut, but that was a really good chat.
Yeah, I hope it's got people thinking,
Thank
and
you. I
enjoy
will
that haircut.
repost and tag you. All right.
So
Thank you.
sounds good.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.